The Gospels tell us that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. They tell us about the visit of the Magi. They tell us about the flight to Egypt and the return to Nazareth. Luke chapter 2 tells us that at the age of 12, Jesus traveled to Jerusalem for the Passover festival and stayed behind in the temple, discussing scripture with the teachers there, astonishing everyone who heard him. His parents found him after 3 days of searching. He returned with them to Nazareth. And then the text says this, "And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man." And that is it. The next time the Gospels mention Jesus by name as an adult active in the world, he is 30 years old, standing at the Jordan River, waiting to be baptized by John. 18 years have passed, and the text says almost nothing about them. 18 years, a third of his life on earth. The years when a boy becomes a man, when a mind develops its deepest convictions, when the experiences that will define a lifetime are accumulated. 18 years of the most extraordinary person who ever lived, and the 4 Gospels that form the foundation of the Christian faith give those years almost no space at all. No ministry, no miracles, no recorded teaching, no major events, just a childhood reference, and then silence, and then the Jordan River. This silence has a name. Scholars and theologians have called it for centuries the hidden years, the silent years, the lost years of Jesus. And for 2,000 years, people of faith, and people without it, have been asking the same question. What was he doing? Where did he go? What happened to the Son of God between the age of 12 and the age of 30? The most important thing to understand before exploring that question is why the Gospel writers may have been silent about those years in the first place. The answer is not necessarily that they were hiding something. The Gospel writers had a specific purpose. They were not writing biographies in the modern sense, where childhood development and young adult experiences are considered essential to understanding a person. They were writing testimonies about the meaning of Jesus, his teaching, his death, and his resurrection. The childhood prologue and then the ministry years were what mattered for that purpose. 18 years of ordinary life in a small town would not have seemed, to a first-century writer with a specific theological purpose, like essential material. But ordinary life in first-century Galilee was not ordinary in the way we use that word today. The world Jesus grew up in was one of the most politically charged, economically oppressed, and spiritually charged environments in the ancient Mediterranean. Nazareth was not a quiet backwater. It was a village in the middle of a region that had experienced Roman military occupation for the entire duration of Jesus' childhood. The town of Sepphoris, one of the largest cities in the region, was being rebuilt by Herod Antipas during exactly the years Jesus would have been growing up and working. It was 4 miles from Nazareth. A carpenter or builder from Nazareth would almost certainly have found work in Sepphoris. The boy Jesus may have spent years working construction in a bustling Greco-Roman city, surrounded by the full cultural complexity of the Roman world, before he ever stood up to teach in a synagogue. Luke chapter 2 tells us specifically that Jesus grew in wisdom. That word is significant. Wisdom in the Jewish tradition is not simply intelligence or knowledge. It is the fruit of experience, study, suffering, and time. It is something that is built, not given. The rabbinical tradition that shaped the world Jesus grew up in emphasized that true wisdom could only come through years of study, practice, and engagement with the real conditions of human life. The fact that Luke uses that specific word suggests that those 18 years were not empty. They were the years in which the wisdom that would later astonish the most learned teachers in Jerusalem was being formed, tested, and deepened. We know from the Gospels themselves what Jesus knew and what he had experienced by the time his ministry began. He knew the Torah thoroughly, not just as a student who had memorized the text, but as someone who could reinterpret it with authority that even the scribes recognized as something different from their own teaching. He knew the Psalms deeply enough to quote them at the most extreme moments of his life. He understood the conditions of agricultural life, the rhythms of planting and harvest, the behavior of seeds, the work of shepherds, the economics of debt and wages. He understood fishing, though he was not a fisherman. He understood the daily reality of poverty with the specificity of someone who had lived it. He understood human nature across a wide range of characters: the religious authorities, the tax collectors, the Roman soldiers, the outcasts, the desperate parents, the ordinary workers. The breadth of human experience that appears in his parables is not the breadth of a man who spent 18 years in one room studying scrolls. It is the breadth of a man who was out in the world. What does Jewish tradition tell us those years would have looked like for a boy from a devout family in Galilee? The structure of Jewish education in the first century followed a fairly well-established pattern. From the ages of 5 to 10, a child studied the Torah, the first 5 books of Scripture, at the local synagogue school. From 10 to 15, they studied the oral Torah, the interpretations and applications of the written law that would later be compiled into the Mishnah. At 15, the most gifted students were selected to continue their studies under a specific rabbi. The others returned to their family trade. They became craftsmen, farmers, fishermen. They married. They built lives. Most boys did not make the cut to continue formal study. Most of them went home at 15 and learned what their fathers had always done. Joseph was a tekton. That Greek word, which our translations often render as carpenter, means something closer to craftsman or builder, someone who worked with wood and stone and other materials. Jesus almost certainly learned that trade. He worked alongside Joseph. He spent his teenage years and his early 20s doing the physical work of building, cutting wood, shaping beams, carrying stone. The boy who would later talk about a man who builds his house on rock rather than sand knew what building on rock and sand actually looked like from the inside. The teacher who told his disciples not to worry about what to eat or wear had spent years in the physical labor of keeping a family fed and clothed. The man who said the greatest among you shall be your servant had worked with his hands for most of his life. There is another dimension to those silent years that most Christians rarely think about. At some point during the hidden years, Joseph disappears from the gospel narrative entirely. He is present during the temple episode when Jesus is 12. By the time Jesus' ministry begins at 30, Joseph is gone. He is never mentioned again. The most plausible conclusion is that Joseph died during those 18 years, that Jesus lost his father while he was still young, before his ministry began, possibly while he was still a teenager. What that loss would have meant, what grief looked like for the Son of God in the middle of an ordinary human life, is something the Gospels do not describe. But the fact that Jesus spoke with such directness and tenderness about mourning, about the comfort of those who grieve, about a father's love for a son who was lost and then found, these things were not abstractions to him. They came from somewhere real. The death of Joseph would also have had practical consequences. As the eldest son in the family, Jesus would have become responsible for his mother and his younger siblings. He would have taken on the full weight of the family trade. The years between his father's death and the beginning of his ministry may have been years of a different kind of responsibility. Not the dramatic responsibility of a public teacher, but the quieter and heavier responsibility of a son who holds a family together. This too would have shaped him. The man who at the moment of his greatest suffering made sure his mother would be taken care of, who looked down from the cross and entrusted her to the beloved disciple, had already spent years in exactly that kind of faithful, invisible care. There is one tradition about the silent years that is ancient enough and consistent enough across multiple sources to deserve serious attention, though it cannot be verified historically. Several early Christian texts and traditions describe Mary Magdalene and certain other figures connected to Jesus as coming from families with some access to the wider Mediterranean world. More importantly, there is a tradition preserved in some early sources that Jesus himself may have traveled before his ministry began. The most discussed version of this tradition involves a journey to Egypt, not the childhood flight to Egypt of Matthew's Gospel, but a later return, as a young man, to study in Alexandria, which was in the 1st century one of the great centers of learning in the entire ancient world. Alexandria housed the largest library that had ever existed. It was home to Jewish, Greek, Egyptian, and other philosophical and religious traditions existing side by side. If there was a place in the ancient world where a young man of extraordinary intellect could have encountered the full breadth of human wisdom across multiple traditions, Alexandria was that place. This tradition cannot be confirmed by any text that most scholars would consider reliable. But it cannot simply be dismissed either. What can be said with confidence is that the breadth of Jesus' knowledge and the sophistication of his engagement with ideas that came from multiple traditions, not just Jewish but also Greek, and broader Mediterranean philosophical currents, is not easy to explain if he never left a small village in Galilee. The Sermon on the Mount contains concepts that resonate not just with Jewish scripture, but with philosophical ideas that were circulating across the ancient Mediterranean. The way Jesus spoke about the inner life, about the relationship between thought and action, about the nature of love as something more than compliance with rules. These ideas have parallels in multiple wisdom traditions of the ancient world. Whether those parallels came from travel, from extraordinary independent thinking, or from divine knowledge that transcended ordinary learning, is a question each person has to answer for themselves. What the silent years are not is empty. Every serious scholar who has studied the historical context of first-century Galilee agrees that the world Jesus grew up in was not a simple or sheltered one. The Roman occupation meant taxation, military presence, periodic violence, and a constant low-level tension between the Jewish population and the imperial power that controlled their land. The religious environment was extraordinarily complex. Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots, ordinary people trying to practice their faith in difficult conditions. The economic conditions meant that the majority of people in Galilee lived at or near subsistence level. This was the environment in which Jesus spent 18 years before he ever opened his mouth to teach in public. When he finally did speak publicly, the reaction was immediate and consistent across all four Gospels. They were astonished at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority and not as the scribes. The scribes taught by citing other authorities. This rabbi said this, that rabbi said that. Jesus said, I tell you. He spoke from somewhere inside himself, from a place of direct knowledge and absolute certainty that no one who heard him had encountered before in a teacher. Where that certainty came from, what those 18 years of preparation and experience and suffering and work and prayer and loss had produced in him, the Gospels do not tell us directly. They show us only the result. A man who stood up at 30 and spoke with the authority of someone who had not just studied the truth, but had lived it, tested it, carried it through the full weight of ordinary human experience, and found it to hold. The silence of the Gospels about those years is not a gap. It is a frame. Everything that Jesus did and said and was during the 3 years the Gospels describe was built on 18 years the Gospels do not describe. The carpenter from Nazareth, who became the teacher, who astonished Jerusalem, did not arrive at that moment by accident. The wisdom that silenced the most learned men of his generation was formed somewhere, in some combination of labor and study and loss and prayer and ordinary life that we are not given the details of. And perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the silence is an invitation. To every ordinary person who reads it, the silence says this: the years when nothing is being recorded are not the years when nothing is happening. They are often the years when everything is being formed,